members, we turn to the question paper proper. At the Chief Minister's request, the first two questions will be taken together as they're substantially on the same topic. I shall call each member to ask her question and then call them for supplementary questions in the usual way. Honourable Member for Council, Miss August-Hanson, question 1.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to ask the Chief Minister for clarity, whether it's the policy of the Council of Ministers that members of the Legislative Council should not be a member of more than one department, and if he'll make a statement. Thank you.
And I call the Honourable Member for Onchan, Miss Edge.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to ask the Chief Minister what reasons underlay the appointment of a member of Legislative Council to 2 departments.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thought for 1 minute I was going to get away without having to answer any questions because we'd run out of time. And I presume the Honourable Member for Douglas East will be withdrawing item 46 because we seem to have had a general debate on the promenade already this morning. But anyway, here we go. I thank the Mr. President for allowing, and the honourable members for allowing me to take 2 questions at the same time. And I can advise honourable members that the Council of Ministers does not have a policy regarding the appointment of members of the Legislative Council to more than one department. Whilst the Council of Ministers recognises the guiding principle provided by this Honourable Court in respect of the appointment of members of the Legislative Council to more than one department, when considering the appointment of members to departments, the Council of Ministers must be pragmatic regarding the political composition of each department to ensure that ministers are appropriately and effectively supported by members with the requisite knowledge, skills and experience required to discharge the responsibilities and obligations of government. It may therefore be necessary, on occasion, to appoint a member of the Legislative Council to more than one department where there are prevailing circumstances which require such an appointment to be made. When recently considering the appointment of a member to the Department of Infrastructure, the Council of Ministers was mindful that the proposed appointment would result in a member of the Legislative Council holding 2 department roles simultaneously. Council did not take this decision lightly, and when making the appointment was also mindful that the composition of the Legislative Council has changed considerably since 2017. I am conscious that some members have indicated that they do not wish to be considered for departmental posts, with others having resigned from departmental roles. Therefore, when determining departmental appointments, the availability and willingness of members to serve must also be considered. All members bring with them an eclectic mix of attributes. It is essential that such attributes are utilised across government in order to ensure the best outcomes for the people of our island. Thank you, Mr. President.
Supplementary question?
Well, I'll
Speaker,
go
Mr. Speaker.
No one else wants one. Well, just to summarise the answer, then the Chief Minister's response is that the policy of the Council of Ministers is directly opposed to the policy that was agreed by Tynwald in just a matter of years ago, which was voted on by Chief Minister and the Minister responsible. It's the Chief Minister, I think, quite clearly said that it was not the policy of Council of Ministers that members should be, Legislative Council should be members of more than one department, but that is the policy of Council of Ministers.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I said, I don't think I said the Council of Ministers had a policy. We obviously are guided by the Tynwald debate, and as stated in my answer, the Council of Ministers recognises the guiding principle provided by this Honourable Court in respect of this matter, but must balance this with the need to act in the best interest of ministers and their departments when considering members for appointment. Now, the guiding principle of Tynwald on this matter does not affect the operation of the Government Departments Act 1987, under which the appointment of members to departments is made, and therefore does not preclude a member of the Legislative Council from being a member of more than one department. But I would like to point out, in the 4 years nearly that we've had this administration, we have done our best to follow the will of Tynwald. Thank you, Mr. President.
Member for Onchan, Miss Edge.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to ask the Chief Minister with regards to the will of Tynwald, and obviously we now have an MLC that is on 2 departments, can the Chief Minister confirm that he won't allow a 3rd department for any MLC? Because it seems there's no, there's no stopping any decisions if the will of Tynwald is not being followed.
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think there's guiding principles here, isn't there? I mean, it's going to be highly unlikely that we're going to have one member doing 3. Should there be suddenly a major illness with half of the Legislative Council, and we have no way of having a member take through legislation who's on the department and understands the department's requirements to take legislation in the legislative forward in the Legislative Council, then we will have to review. So it's highly unlikely, but you've got to keep an open mind. You can never say never. I cannot see it happening for the rest of this administration, if ever in the future. Thank you.
Mr. Harmer.
Thank you. Would the Chief Minister agree with me, as it was actually, I put the amendment regarding this and the speech regarding this matter, that it was about having the democratic balance within any department, so that there wasn't a multiple of MLCs as department members in a department. So, for example, 3 MLCs or no MHKs and a minister. And that was really the thrust of the amendment that I put. And of course, the other point is that would agree with me that it is a guiding principle because it has the word should, and it has to be referenced with the speech that I made, and it wasn't a must, because that is a very different approach as the other principles. So would you agree with me that actually it does fit not only the amendment but also the spirit that the amendment was placed? Thank you.
Chief Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank the honourable member for his comments. I have 28 pages in front of me of the speeches and the motions that day. It was on the 21st of November 2017. If honourable members would enjoy a good read in their spare time, which I'm sure they haven't got, and it was in the spirit. And we try to follow the will of Tynwald in the spirit, but from time to time exceptional circumstances arise. It's happened in this situation. We have an excellent member of Legislative Council who has experience in housing, and it seemed a logical thing to do. And as I say, it's always done for the best of the people of the Isle of Man. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Council, Mrs. Lord Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the Chief Minister have any suggestion as to what members in this court and the public are to take when we make resolutions of Tynwald? How do we know whether it's going to just simply be treated as a general principle, or whether it's actually going to have full weight of being a resolved position of Tynwald? So that's my first question. And the second question is, why hasn't the part in the debate been taken account of when the Honourable Member for Peel and Glent-Faber moved the amendment? Why hasn't the aspect been taken account where it was about MLCs having more time to take on the valuable scrutiny role, and that being beneficial to the overall outcomes and contribution? Because that's the part of the speech that I remember when that, in reading it, when that amendment was moved and then fully approved by Tynwald. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chief Minister.
Narrowly.
Thank you. I think I've been very clear on what the motion said and how it impacts on the relevant act, the 1997 Government Departments Act. The fact that we've observed the general thrust of the view of Tynwald shows that we take that seriously, but we are faced with some members who will not serve on a department, and therefore we must have departments who have members with to take the legislation forward to help the smooth processing of that day-to-day running of that department. Yes, it was clearly said about giving members of the upper house time for scrutiny, which I fully support, because I think there's too much interference in policy, and it's the scrutiny that I look for from members, not constant policy demands from certain members. Thank you.
Ms. August-Hanson, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. President. As the Chief Minister has twice now mentioned that we need members of Legislative Council in departments because they need to take legislation through the Legislative Council. Does he recognise the fact that it is possible for MLCs not to be in departments but to take through legislation for government? And also, that has taken place, and that members of Legislative Council have worked hard on pieces of legislation, regardless of being in departments or not. Can he also tell me when Legislative Council have last declined to take through a piece of legislation on behalf of government? Thank you, Mr. President.
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. President, sorry, my apologies. I think the latest legislation that the Department of Infrastructure wanted to take through was declined and then accepted and then declined again by a member of the Legislative Council. Obviously, you're looking for a member of the Legislative Council who has experience in that department, because their general understanding will enable them to give a better speech and answer to supplementaries to their colleagues in the Legislative Council. So you want the Legislative Council to have the as much information as possible when they're making their decisions, and therefore a member who sat on the department understands that's the preferred bit. Yes, there are times when members very kindly offer to take forward legislation for the Council of Ministers or for a department in the Legislative Council, and we gratefully are grateful for that. But there has been a time when we've had to ask our Attorney General to take it through because we couldn't get a member to do it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Now, 4 more supplementaries, then we move on. Miss Edge.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're all going to have to be careful with our shoulds and our musts, aren't we? I'd just like to ask the Chief Minister, I met with him on the 7th of July with regards to this, and he clearly advised me at that point in time that he wasn't aware that our honourable colleague for Council was going to be doing housing. However, he's also just stated that he doesn't believe that MLCs should be involved in policy, and clearly housing is a heavy policy area. So I'd just like to further understand what the Chief Minister is talking about.
Chief Minister.
More than happy to answer that. Normally when I have a meeting with a backbench in my office, the conversation is private. I don't discuss it with anyone else. I don't expect the honourable member to do the same. Yes, the honourable member was concerned about the appointment. I said I would inquire to the Minister, which I did, and Council of Ministers was more than happy with the appointment of one of the many hard-working MLCs to come on to a department and help out. Now, obviously, policy is policy. I feel that, personally, when we're in Tynwald, policy is to me personally, it's my personal view, that the members of the House of Keys decide that the policy, the elected members and the upper house carefully scrutinise the legislation to make sure that we've got it right. Is there a better way of doing it going forward, and then working harmoniously as a team for the greater good of the Isle of Man? It mightn't seem naive, but that's how I see this working as we go forward. Thank you, Mr. President.
Honourable Member for Douglas Central, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Cabinet Office has taken a substantial part of the legislative programme through since it was formed, and Cabinet Office has never had an MLC. How does Cabinet Office cope? The second point is that the Government Departments Act has been mentioned quite often in the Chief Minister's answers, Mr. President. Would the Chief Minister advise whether there was any moment or risk of a moment when Department of Infrastructure or any other department wasn't legally constituted because it didn't have a departmental member? And secondly, could the Chief Minister confirm, he might have misspoken, presumably he doesn't really mean that government only takes into account the spirit of Tynwald resolutions when it goes forward with government policy?
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. We clearly checked as the Council of Ministers that we were not breaking any Tynwald rules by making the appointment. That was important to us. If Tynwald had clearly said, and it was binding over the 87 Act, then of course we would have complied and we wouldn't have made the appointment. But it clearly, we could. We felt for the greater good of the island it was important to have, with all the legislation going forward and etc., and the fact that the department was low on numbers, that we would ask a member to come in. I don't think at any one time the department it was down to the minimum requirement of having a political representation, Mr. President, but it never breached that. Thank you.
Mrs. Lord Brennan.
Thank you, Mr President. On the policy point, would the Chief Minister be of the view that the role of MLCs within departments, bearing in mind what he said about policy, should perhaps be looked at, particularly in reference to the Government Departments Act? You know, it is part of, I think, collective responsibility of a department, so there's no differentiation between MHKs and MLCs and departments. Does he think there should be, bearing his mind about his comments about policy? Secondly, given the number of endeavours that are actually cross-departmental and the value of consulting generally with Tynwald members and actually the value of oversight versus political responsibility, does he recognise that there is a value in Tynwald members overall playing a role to the overall effort that is not just about being within executive government? Thank you, Mr President.
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr President. Yes, I believe when an MLC sits on a department, they are equal to an MHK. When they have the same vote, and therefore they have the same authority. I'm talking about when we're in Tynwald Chamber, where House of Keys makes the policy and Tynwald debates the effectiveness of that policy. But that is my personal view. I'm just clarifying that again. Could the Honourable Member remind me of the second point? Sorry.
If the Chief Minister sees that there is value in having input from Tynwald members to the overall endeavours, which might be cross-departmental, because there's other ways to have value in terms of oversight and as a consultative role, rather than all Tynwald members contributing only through being members of executive government.
Chief Minister.
Thank you. I know all ministers of the Council of Ministers will welcome advice, comments, help, views from all political members and outside. It's always welcome. But once the elected members have made a policy decision going forward, then that's with tweaking and advice on how maybe the legislation hasn't been worded correctly to achieve the aim. I personally feel that is how we should be working together, not having elected members' policy overturned and significantly amended by the upper house. That's my personal view, I hasten to add.
Call Mrs Masker, followed by Miss August-Hanson, then Miss Edge, and then we're on to question 3 thereafter. Mrs Masker.
Thank you, Mr President. Would the Chief Minister agree that everyone who comes into this honourable court comes in with the will to serve, and we all do our very best to fulfil that role? Would the Chief Minister agree that the taking on of another department by an MLC might be absolutely dedicated to serving without any additional reward or thanks? As the Lord Bishop said yesterday, we come to serve without thanks. I am not looking for thanks, nor am I looking for any extra remuneration. I'm working twice as hard as I ever have. And I would also say, or would the Chief Minister agree, it is possible for an MLC, being a member of a department, to help the scrutiny that is carried out within that department. And my experience up to now is that I have been able, absolutely, to do that. And my ministers that I serve with, I hope, will be able to confirm that if anybody needs to ask. I would also say, yes, in the Court of Tynwald, we do have an equal vote, every one of us, and that is about making policy. So I would ask the Chief Minister if he's able to just confirm my view of where things are today.
Thank you very much, Mr President. I'm delighted to confirm that the Honourable Member is not being extra paid for this. I genuinely, and I'm sure the Minister greatly appreciates her taking the time to help the department through a tough period where it's low on numbers, it's got key policies coming down the pipeline, it's got the biggest construction project probably the island has seen in 50 years. And we've had a lengthy debate of nearly an hour on the problems faced by the department, and having someone on board who is prepared to roll their sleeves up and help the department through this tough period of time is very commendable. And I do thank the honourable member for, well, she didn't ask for thanks, but I would like to give her thanks for being prepared to put her head above the parapet, knowing that this sort of questioning might happen, but still be prepared to go ahead to help the department and therefore the people of this Isle of Man go forward. And for that I'm eternally grateful. Thank you.
Ms August-Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I've certainly had a conversation with Mrs. Masker ahead of actually putting this question on the order paper, and she was more than happy for me to do so, and more than happy for me to sort of put my own views forward. Now, I understand how important it is to have members in departments.
Please.
I am coming to my question. Thank you, Mr. President. Understanding how important it is to have members in departments, and it is important, incredibly important, and understanding that Mrs. Masker has an incredible input into our into our system, and certainly into government
waiting for
as
a
well.
question.
I'm getting there. Thank you, Mr. President. What does the Chief Minister consider of those that are not in departments then that do offer a very serious level of scrutiny and do spend an awful lot of time on pieces of legislation but don't necessarily sit in departments? Does he feel that we add value in any way? This is a piece of legislation, I know that other members of this council, that is in draft form at the moment. Is this level of scrutiny that happens before legislation actually reaches the branches considered to be important to him? Thank you, Mr. President.
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Of course I look for value, and I'm grateful to legislative members for giving the scrutiny. There are times when I know Mrs. Poole-Wilson regularly pulls us up on mistakes that we've made, on maybe the wording's not quite right, and I know, for example, the Honourable Member for Council, Mrs. Poole-Wilson, cannot sit on departments because she's got so many conflictions with the sterling work she does as the equality champion, to name but a few items. So yes, I really genuinely do value the scrutiny, because we don't always get it right in the House of Keys when it comes to the legislation side of things. And I have stood and defended the upper house when there was some who wanted to do away with it on that principle, if honourable members will remember back in 2016. Thank you.
Final question, Miss Edge.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think we need to comment that there's lots of members in here work on 2 departments as well as committees. There's some that have only worked on 1. But I'd like, the Chief Minister's clearly stood up and you know, I totally agree with what he's saying with regards to policy is for elected members. I therefore ask the Chief Minister again that, knowing that an MLC is going into a department, into a key policy area, did he think that was appropriate? When he then also says that LegCo's in a department for scrutiny and legislation. So can the Chief Minister confirm that he, on one hand, is saying that policy is for elected members within the House of Keys to bring it forward, and then in the next breath he's supporting this appointment? Thank you, Mr. President.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think it's really important that we have people with the relevant skills and prepared to help in departments. Back in 2017, nearly every department had, well, I think all departments had an MLC member. That's not the case now. I personally find that sad, but that's the will of individuals, and you know, some stood with that specific view, and I respect that. But I have to ensure that departments get things done, and if it means having 1 MLC do 2 departments, it's tough on that MLC, but I genuinely appreciate it. But if that means we get things done for the good of the people of the island, that to me has to be a satisfactory outcome. The fact that we haven't done it for this is nearly 4 years shows that we've, as I said before, we've respected the views of Tynwald, But the circumstances we face where we need the extra support, I think, was balanced, thought through by the Council of Ministers and unanimously supported. Thank you.